Jason is letting a few more people into the room. And as he does so, we are going to get started. And friends, I would like to welcome you to our, get ready for it, 46th online gathering for congregational leaders across the country. This time is called Being Church, and it is sponsored by ELCA's coaching ministry. I am Jill Beverlin, and I am so blessed to be the National Coordinator of Coaching for the ELCA, and I'm one of your facilitators today. It's important for us to be reminded that this time is meant to be a safe and brave space for the people of our church to bring the truth of who they are and how they are doing. These conversations are an intentional step to live more fully into God's dream for us as the body of Christ. Today, we are honored to have Amy Reumann, Director of ELCA Advocacy, with us. Here's a little bit about the advocacy team. Their mission is to connect faith and public life. That's a very worthy goal, isn't it, friends? And here's the description about the work they do that can be found on the ELCA website. As members of the ELCA, we believe that we are freed in Christ to serve and love our neighbor. God uses our hands through our direct service and our voices through our advocacy efforts to restore and reconcile our world. Through faithful advocacy, the ELCA lives out our Lutheran belief that governments can help advance the common good. I think that recent events show us that that hinge point is can help us. There's more to be said on that. ELCA Advocacy works for change in public policy based on the experience of Lutheran ministries, programs, and projects around the world and in communities across the United States. The advocacy team, through political channels on behalf of the following biblical values: peacemaking, hospitality to strangers, care for creation, and concern for people living in poverty and struggling with hunger and disease. God's Spirit has surely guided our Wednesday gatherings. And as you would imagine, once again, serendipity has stepped in. Jason and I actually met with Amy before the holidays. We did not know, of course, about what would happen on January 6th. And so it is in this serendipitous moment that we are humbled and honored to have Amy join us. Amy, thank you so much for being here with us. I can't imagine how full your plate is right now as you prepare to continue responding to what happened on January 6th and prepare for the upcoming inauguration. So we're anxious to hear what you have to share and how we might be Christ-like leaders in this time. Amy, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Jason, for making everything work. And thank you all for your leadership in your ministries, wherever those are, and for engaging today around the ministry of advocacy that we are called to as church, as followers of Jesus, and our work as advocacy in the ELCA is one way of among many that we have options to do that, but I think is a powerful and important way. I'd like to make this time as interactive as possible and as hands-on for what you need and want to learn about and discern about. So I do have some things prepared to share, and then would like to move to whatever kind of questions or conversation before we go into some smaller group discussions. I also want to say you have a dedicated advocacy staff who serve in the Washington, D.C. office. One of them is here with me today. Giovanna Oaxaca is our Migration Policy Program Director, and I will put her on the spot in a little bit because the very important work that she does on immigration, with asylum seekers, on family detention, on DACA, on so many things that we care about in terms of this this church's public witness. And so you should invite her back for a dedicated time sometime too. I'm going to start out with some scripture. I led devotions for the domestic mission unit on Monday and shared from the prophet Isaiah in the 61st chapter. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. And they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord to display his glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. On Sunday, I walked with my ninth grade daughter to the Capitol to bear witness, to see what a place that I love and care about looks like, surrounded now by perimeter fencing, patrolled by National Guard troops, and to pray there as they were preparing for the procession for the officer who was killed on Wednesday. As we were walking down, she was saying, having just gone back to school, how much she hated history class. And when asked why, she said, because history is only about bad things. She said, we started with slavery, and then we talked about wars, and then we learned about violence, and then more wars. And she said, I'm beginning to think this is all that people are. And those words struck me because I was hearing them at the same time that we've heard so many people say in the aftermath of last week's riot and mob and insurgency, fueled by white supremacy and carrying the signs and symbols of Christian nationalism, that this is not who we are, right? I don't want to recognize myself in that event and in those people and in the sanctioning of our symbols and I think what we hold dear and how we understand the gospel to be. Because I think the road ahead for us as Christians, as Lutherans, as citizens and those who live here in these United States is a confession and an acknowledgement of how we got here, that what was unleashed and the permission given for white supremacy and white Christian nationalism to be such a motivating force isn't new in our history, but it's been given new permission. And so that we need to confess that and name that, as Luther said, we have to call a thing what it is, right? A theology of glory calls evil good, but a theologian of the cross calls out evil for what it is. And it weighs a heavy and essential responsibility on us. But I'm finding in the verses of Isaiah some really new things as I think about these things and what our path ahead is as a church, and especially as we witness here in Washington, D.C. The first is, I had never noticed in Isaiah how those who the servant here preaches to, the brokenhearted, right? The broken, the captives, those who have been oppressed, they're actually the ones charged with rebuilding, right? It's not the elites as the exiles come back to Jerusalem who do the rebuilding. It's those who know the oppression most. It's those who have suffered most. It's those who can see the system that got them where they are, who are the ones in charge with dismantling it and building something new that shines with a greater kind of justice, without which reconciliation and going forward is impossible. I don't know how I missed that. But there it is. And when I think about what our next moments are, as I read the reflections and challenges from non-white communities within the ELCA, I'm hearing those same voices, even many conversations I've had here in DC recently. Who are we listening to about what needs to be done now and what was at the root of that violence and what happened, and therefore what our next steps need to be. The other thing I noticed, though, the role of the servant of the Lord here is to preach the word and in some ways to get out of the way, to declare that liberation and then see what happens, and is to be anointed to bring that good news to those who are oppressed, because then they are the ones who will take root and become the oaks of righteousness. And so I think about that in terms of how we make decisions and who is leading in this church, and maybe what we need to rethink going ahead. And that goes for advocacy as much as anything else. And I wrote this up into a blog post and put it out today in case anyone wants to follow up on that or proof text what I did. I'll tell one story about myself, which is, I think, part of what's at the heart of how I came to do advocacy, and to find that as a calling within the church. When I was in my early 20s, I was able to spend 2 weeks in what was then the former East Germany. And I went there for the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's birth in 1983, and spent a week doing interpreting for all the official ceremonies for people who didn't speak German. And then was able to spend a few days with Bishop Domaney, who was the Bishop of Namibia, which was a country in Southern Africa, then still suffering under apartheid. And so I spent days with him visiting country parishes in Saxony and interpreting for him as he told the story of Namibian Lutherans, oppressed and denied full rights and facing violence from their government if they spoke up for human rights and decency and justice, exchanging views with East German Lutherans who told about their experience that if they were to speak up about the demands of the gospel and the demands of justice, they also faced similar consequences. And finding in their sharing, asking myself, well, in my country, I can speak up at any time, but do I dare? And why don't I? Without repercussions. And in the freedom that I have, I learned from their testimony to each other and encouragement of one another. I really think that's a moment for me where God gave me an aha moment that we are called to this as part of our baptism. And really have spent all my years of study and ministry since exploring that question, to the point where I've been entrusted with this amazing ministry of advocacy that we have as the ELCA. Couple slides and resources to share with you as I talk about it, and then really want to get to your conversations, our conversation. I want to say a couple things about our grounding for advocacy in the ELCA, because we don't do it just because we don't do it just because. We do it because we have a theological and biblical understanding that starts throughout Scripture, whether it's the testimony of the prophets to speak justice, or whether it's Jesus's proclamation. As you know, he read from the scroll of Isaiah chapter 61 when he launched his formal ministry, to the practices of the early church. Luther explores this, lifts it up for us, and sends us forth with a really bold and beautiful vision of what it is to be Christian and what it is to be the church. He handed us the theology of the cross, right? Which I just referenced, that we need to call what is evil, evil. And Jesus calls us to be where suffering happens, wherever the cross is planted. And we do that in so many ways as church. And one of those ways is advocacy. Very often when I'm doing a workshop, I'll do what I call the circle of response. And I draw a big circle and I say, how do we as church respond to human need? And people have all sorts of answers when we do these things. We pray, right? We give money, we march in the streets and do activism, we organize, and we also can do advocacy. And without all these things, if we can do one instead of the other, but if we don't do all of them, we're not getting to the root causes of many problems. And that working through policy change with the values of the church is one way that we do that. Luther also called us, he has this wonderful phrase. He says, we are to proclaim the world of God publicly, boldly, and honestly. Publicly, boldly, and honestly. And to me, advocacy is an extension of our witness that we do. It's proclamation of the word, just in a different context. We may not be inviting someone to come and worship with us, is how we usually think of evangelism, right? But it's saying the gospel has been laid on my heart so that I look at how my neighbor is suffering, or I stand with my neighbor to say no more, or here's how greater justice can be achieved. It is a proclamation of our faith. And I think if we exercise that muscle more, we might find new ways to be proclaiming Jesus in our time. And embracing evangelism, telling of the good news in public ways that we haven't always as a church that sometimes is accused of quietism. I also think as baptized Christians, we know in the baptismal formula, right, strive for justice and peace in all the earth. But in all the language of the formula, especially in being called to proclaim God's word, we're called to proclaim it not just when it's comfortable, but also when it's uncomfortable. And advocacy is that invitation to do so. I am nervous every time I go into a member of Congress's office. I never say quite the right thing. I do the postmortem afterwards on what I should have said. But it is in that practice that I actually have come to go deeper in my own faith. And I find advocates, after they go to their meetings, they will come back excited, even if the meeting was terrible. And they're told, I will never vote that way on that bill, because they have gone deep and spoken out of what is important to them. And now my cat is jumping on the screen as I said he would. Couple quick things. The advocacy that we do, we don't pull it out of the sky. At least as we're doing it for the institution, we have rich social teaching, our social statements, our social messages, a brand new one on government and civic engagement. I commend to you with a great study guide so that we can talk about what do we think about government? What kind of a force is it in our life, and how do we speak to it? Either when we think it is erring, how do we evaluate it, and how do we accompany it? I'd like to show you a brief video from our advocacy site. I'm checking time, just 3 minutes. We have some videos that are for use, for your use for, here's share screen, for you to use that are available on our website. And this is one of them. And if I can start the slideshow, can you see my screen? Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this. Here we go. Oops. See, I knew this would happen. Anybody know how I can go back? Hold on.
You might just try your left arrow on your keyboard.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm there.
Through baptism, we are called into the world to serve our neighbor and steward God's good creation. We respond to God's grace in Jesus Christ through ministries that address suffering in the world and promote the common good.
As Lutherans, our attention turns to the policies that make a broader difference in our lives and the lives of our vulnerable neighbors. In our homes and congregations, as well as around the country and world, we hear cries that may be overlooked or disregarded.
I am here for education.
I'm here for caring for creation. I am here for human rights,
clean water, more use of solar technology,
gender equity,
immigration issues,
for justice.
With so many issues in our communities, policymakers can't be experts on all of them. Elected officials are enthusiastic about meeting with their constituents and hearing about their experiences. Bringing your voice into the process matters, as we speak alongside those without traditional, economic, or political power.
Our ministry of advocacy is our witness and call for justice. Here are some tips for confidently and effectively engaging with policymakers. Decide what you have to say in a way that can be heard. About 2 minutes of personal, clear narrative.
Practice and get comfortable with what you want to say.
Combine your story with what's happening now in the policymaking landscape, so it can stick where it will do the most good.
Remember your thank yous, out of kindness and sincerity. You'll be dealing with people who entered public service with the potential to influence our communities for the better.
Share how your faith impacts your thinking on an issue, or point out how your local ministry is taking action to address challenges in your community.
And let elected officials and staff know you and your congregation hold your leaders in prayer. God is calling us into the world to serve together. Through advocacy, we stand up for policies that create opportunities to end hunger, overcome poverty, promote peace and dignity, and preserve God's creation.
For us to be able to speak up for ourselves and for our communities that we're representing is powerful.
We have to take control of many more things.
Advocacy is important to me for my own struggle as an LGBTQ individual, but also a person that fights for the vulnerable, rooted in my faith.
Everyone needs an opportunity, and only by addressing the root causes of problems can we find solutions.
It is really about making sure that the values that are guiding our decision makers are in sync with the values that we have as a community.
It's especially important to be able to be a voice for people who don't have that outlet or don't have a chance to speak for themselves.
You too can bring your voice into the public sphere. As your partner, reach out to ELCA Advocacy's national and state offices for training, resources, and assistance to equip and engage your faith through advocacy.
In words from the ELCA social statement, Church and Society, a Lutheran perspective, we live in a diverse, divided, and threatened global society. The ELCA is committed to defend human dignity, to stand with poor and powerless people, to advocate justice, to work for peace, and to care for the earth in the processes and structures of contemporary society. Acting in faith, we are prepared to care.
So as the ELCA and our Witness in Society, we do so through our federal policy office. We have a new policy agenda that will be released either late this week or early next week about what we will be doing with the next Congress. That reflect the priorities of our church in domestic hunger and poverty, racial and gender equity, in international policy, in immigration and migration, as well as in creation care. We also work at the state level. We are unique among denominations in that we have 18 state public policy offices, as well as our corporate social responsibility work. That could be a whole subject for another day, working with corporations who make so many decisions in the society, as well as at our United Nations office. I mentioned the new social message on government and civic engagement in the United States, Discipleship in a Democracy. It's been invaluable to me this fall as we've worked through this election season to talk about not just election work, but faithful engagement year round, and especially around our values in a democracy, especially at a time where I believe we're called to help rebuild that democracy. Lots of ways. Also should mention, we are, as a church, starting a process of a social statement on church and state. That'll be a 4-year process. There'll be multiple opportunities for congregations and ministries to study the drafts and to offer input. Year round, in our federal policy office, as well as in our state offices, we have action alerts. We have ways to engage through social media, as well as blogs that are offered, but from ELCA Advocacy as well from Amparo, and I'll invite Gio to say something in a minute. We have more and more resources looking at racial equity and issues through a racial equity lens. And one of the recent ones being a hunger-related resource. ELCA Votes remains extremely popular, lots of engagement this year, and I'm looking forward to building on that enthusiasm around elections to deepen it around ongoing civic engagement work. Just 2 resources to call to your attention. One is Women of the ELCA has renewed this wonderful study series they have called To Be Political, but I Don't Want to Be Political, that I think addresses a lot of the hesitations in churches to take on advocacy, and how do you get past some of the voices that immediately try to stop conversations about our life together and what we as a church are called to do. And then we have a brand new resource, just came out this week, Advocacy 101 for Young Adults, where faith meets public policy. And it was created by our Young Adult Hunger Fellows last year. And it's got wonderful video and audio components and activities for young adults, or frankly, not so young adults. Gio, I'm going to ask if you have a few words to say about your work and your ministry, and to invite everyone here into it.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me just fine. As Amy mentioned, as Amy mentioned, I am the new Migration Policy Program Director at the ELCA, and I work on all issues specifically related to immigration, refugee, and asylum. I am also on the executive committee for our church's strategy for accompanying migrant minors and families called Amparo. And I really welcome you all to become involved in all sorts of advocacy, not just specifically the cause that I'm so passionate about that led me to work here for the ELCA on immigration issues, but anything that really touches your heart. I think Amy shared what drove her to advocacy in her life. For me, it is specifically being a directly impacted person, somebody who has been impacted by immigration policy, knows what sorts of humane solutions there are for the broken system that we have in our country. That's what led me to want to make a change. And I'm sure you all have stories about people in your lives who are suffering the consequences of an immigration system that perhaps is not as friendly or humane as it could be. And so I welcome you all to lift up those stories and enter into a relationship with people in your community who are immigrants. Tell your own immigrant story, because we all have one in this country, and then use those powerful stories to supplement your advocacy around the issues that matter. I'm happy to link any Amparo resources into the chat and share them with Jill. But if you're interested, I'll put a plug in here now for next week. There will be another coaching session with where we will specifically be talking about some of the work that's done around immigrants.
Jill, I'm turning to you. I think we've talked enough. Would love to know what is on people's minds, or what might be helpful, or whether to go to small groups now.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to clarify one date. Gio referenced an upcoming session. That's actually 2 Wednesdays from now. We have the people, if you remember, friends, those of you that were on with Sarah Jackson, who presented about Casa de Paz, the house that love built. This is a follow-up to that particular story and a documentary that was created showing the work of Casa. And so that will be on, Jason, help me, the 27th of January, correct? Okay. And hope to have Gio with us then as well. Next week, as a preview, we decided, because we don't know what will happen in the hours before our meeting, that it was best for us to say we will all be here. We are holding space. We are inviting a few speakers from our diverse populations to be ready to speak into whatever it is that unfolds. I think that the 6th, if we thought that COVID forced us to learn how to pivot, January 6th showed us just be ready. And so we will be here, and we want to, with our best grounded biblical selves, to unpack the events and to continue to unpack. And so, Amy, I'm going to share with you something that popped into the chat section, and I'll read it to you. And I really do covet and beg your response to this, because I think that John's sharing is something that is representative, at least in conversations that I am invited into several times a week, especially as this current administration has gone on. This is a topic that has come to me again and again and again. And I think that pastors are seeking guidance on how to navigate these particular waters. So, serving in a conservative rural community, I am aware of white members of my congregation who feel oppressed by political and corporate systems. They feel ignore them, who are supportive of those who try to dismantle and rebuild those systems through electing Donald Trump, and even perhaps by descending on our nation's capital in an attempt to do what they believe was a rigged election. While this is not my viewpoint, I do not condone violence, I can understand some of the anger and frustration. To preach and minister in this context presents a real challenge to our rural pastors. How do we proclaim and work for justice in these contexts? How does the church speak into this situation?
Yeah, that is, I would say if there's any resource or any question that's asked anywhere I go, it's not about an issue. It's about how do we talk to one another? How do we stay in the room long enough to listen to one another as church? And I think that's something many leaders and many of you probably are struggling with as well. I still cling to the hope that the church is one place where we still can have those conversations, that our identity in the gospel is stronger than what pulls on us in a partisan way. Some days it's harder to cling to that than others, but we still do represent, a purple reality in the ELCA as a whole. Couple thoughts. Well, first of all, particularly since you mentioned rural realities, probably one of the most eye-opening things I did was going with our environmental policy director and domestic director to North and South Dakota, where we had listening sessions there. And in our work on climate and our work on energy, heard from people who were directly felt hurt and disregarded by their church. Apparently there had been a blog post years ago about meatless Mondays that some ranchers, still remembered. It was really important to sit there and listen. And I'm not going to say that solved anything, but I see those faces and hear those people when we talk about our environmental work and how we frame it and who we need to listen to. And really, if we're going to have solutions in this country, we've got to incorporate those voices. We can't, we're on the cusp of a new administration. The pendulum's going to swing, all sorts of things are going to get enacted. And then when things flip again, it's all going to go back. How do we create something? And how do we, as a denomination that hugs the middle very often, how can we be a mediating force and a bridge builder in a very polarized time in state legislatures and in Congress? I believe we do have a role to play in that. We've been working with particular groups on on having these conversations, among them Braver Angels, the Frank Zeidler Center in Milwaukee, some of you may know, the Living Room Conversations Project. And while we have some synods that are doing some experiments with these are the sorts of things I would like to bring to a larger ELCA audience, especially that there's a project called Holding America Together by the Braver Angels organization. We just had an event last night, sort of in the wake of the violence last week and the inauguration next. How do we keep our fractured community talking and listening?
Thank you for that response, Amy. And definitely we have a lot of space for civil discourse and the practice of that to swoop in and help shape how we are both church together and how we engage the communities around us where God has planted us. And a follow-up question by John, specifically what resources are there for advocating for rural justice that does not demean the ag community and people who make their living on the land and through raising livestock?
Yeah, Gia will probably have some response to this as well. I mean, I will say in our work on the Farm Bill, we partnered with agricultural organizations, both to learn from their agenda, and particularly, while hunger is at the core of what we do, we really this past Farm Bill session lifted up and learned a lot about infrastructure, about the importance of broadband right now has been something that we've been leading some conversations around, both in urban and rural areas. That if we're going to learn, if we're going to communicate, if people are going to be able to work, we need access. And this is, I think, a potentially unifying, not just Democratic, Republican, but a rural issue that is of extreme importance. you know, we've had to learn about what language to use when talking about concepts that climate can turn people off, but sustainability, and knowing how much our farmers and those who work the land value and want to sustain what is, and we are planning on holding a session, some rural ministry listening sessions this year as well. If anyone here would be interested in hosting in your area, we would love to get an invitation for those who do advocacy to learn more about the issues of importance and be able to represent that. We also are moving forward, while this isn't strictly rural, of working much more on the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery through advocacy. And have been working with a small team discerning issues that are important for tribal nations, many of which have some rural concerns within it, so that we are better representing that commitment of the church in repudiation and word and deed. But Gio.
No, I think that's a really great question. I think specifically, I want to bring your attention to the work that we do with the National Farm Worker Ministry and what they do to call attention to some of the issues facing rural communities, not just landowners themselves, but the people who till the land, people who are responsible for bringing food to our tables. And by that I mean migrant farm workers, people on temporary work visas here, who could stand to benefit from better policies to protect their health, to protect their rights as workers. I'll link it in the chat, but they do a really great work to specifically mention some of the policies that could be changed at a federal level as well as at a state level. And we'll be meeting later this month to discuss what are some plans for the year ahead. But we do work with them specifically. Anytime I think that we can talk about rural issues in the frame of how can we restore justice to and ensure that nobody's dignity is being denied, that's sort of where we want to go in that direction. I also want to mention that I was part of a different organization right before I started here at the ELCA that did a series of rural roundtables as well, and found those really enlightening because the solutions that people were looking for to help their communities would have benefited everyone across the social stratum. So the workers themselves, the farmers themselves, everybody would be benefited by access to rural broadband, better healthcare, telemedicine, things of those nature. And everyone stands to benefit when we have access to those essential policies. So yes, I linked it into the chat there.
Okay, thank you for that. And we will entertain this additional question from another colleague before we potentially go out to breakout rooms, because I think this question really hits on the aspect of truth, Amy and Gio, and how do we engage that? Who gets to say what's truth? Because that has become so very blurred for us. And so the encouragement that I have for each of us is just to remember that God works with each of us individually and collectively over time. And it's not like we're going to have one conversation and necessarily change someone else's mind about something. And it's so easy, isn't it, to see the truth for someone else versus the truth in our own lives. And one encouragement I have, and I have no idea if this is supporting Amy and Gio's recommendations, is to just speak the truth for myself, because that is the truth that I know. And sometimes in modeling the ways that I have recognized that I have been blinded, or how my understanding of truth has changed over time, can sometimes inspire others to engage in that same line of thinking without being accusatory and just increasing that sense of being confrontational and causing defensiveness, which completely shuts down conversation and then any opportunity of having civil discourse where change hopefully can occur. So yeah, the next question is, how do we distinguish and encourage others to distinguish real concerns and grievances from the big lie and the proliferation of blatant falsehoods and conspiracy theories? In Idaho, 3%, and the NRA seem to think seem to have more influence on my Lutheran PK siblings these days. Glad to see the Braver Angels connection. Over a year ago, I was asked to lead the blue team for a day of dialogue by my pastor and ended up recruiting more of the red team. Had relationships with at St. John's in Sacramento. Red and blue labels are problematic and insufficient.
Well, Mark Carlson, I know that came from you, so thank you for that. I think I'd like to say I'm not in the business of truth. I'm in the business of public policy, which is which changes sometimes. We actually just had a staff meeting today. We have a practice of not endorsing legislation because you may endorse it, but it can really change, and then your name's on it, and kind of the ins and outs of that. But what I do want to say, we actually put out something this fall on misinformation. And how to help spot misinformation. I mean, this was brought around by what was happening in the campaign and misinformation from many quarters, right? And how we can be more savvy consumers. You know, if our allegiance is to the truth of Christ, we need to be committed to discerning our own truth, but also listening to the truth of our neighbor. And sorry. You know, and so I think in our Church and Society, a Lutheran Perspective social statement, it says that we're called to be several things, and one is a community of moral discourse and moral engagement. And I think that's a muscle that's a little flabby in the church. Because that can be a scary place to go. It's an extra thing to do. We got enough to do, right, in our congregations. And sometimes, you know, we can't agree on the color of the sanctuary carpet, you know, so why are we going to talk about hot button issues of the day? I mean, just a few things that I've learned about. To talk about these things that can be divisive, you need to start small. Don't necessarily start with, you know, abortion or the death penalty. Let's talk about why. I told this story to Jill. She said I should share it. I once had a pastor come into my office when I was in our advocacy office in Pennsylvania to say, how come our pantry keeps running out of food and the food bank can't give us any more? We're unable to purchase what we need like we used to be able to do. What's going on? And I was like to say, well, that's because in Pennsylvania, the funding has run out for the state food purchase programming, but we are advocating right now for more money to be put in it because that's how you are able to then serve your community with the food that they need. And this pastor became an awesome advocate who incorporated hunger advocacy into everything that he then went on to do. Including when he was elected bishop to make it a central part of his synod's ministry. And I think there's education needed too about why things are. Your food bank, your pantry can't get the food because we need to advocate and say this food is important. So you have to tell your story. And if we are people of the story, or we are people called to public witness, that story needs to be told. I want to give one caveat and correction to our video. One person said, you know, our job is, or our call is to be a voice for the voiceless. I'm trying to abolish that. I mean, sometimes we do need to speak for people who don't have the opportunity, but everyone has the ability. And the extent to which our advocacy can become more accompaniment and providing the platform and the occasion for people to tell their story directly to those who need to hear it, rather than channeling it through my frames. I think there's something both beautiful and faithful in that, that we're trying to learn how to do better to bring that grassroots urgency and witness to Congress, to state capitals, to school boards, you know, and the rest.
Amy and Gio, you both are fantastic spokespeople for the work of advocacy. And I think that to be true to the purpose of this gathering, we do want to give you a few minutes to go to a breakout room and just have that conversation. You know, what's been presented today and what is a small faithful step that you can take either for yourself or in leading the community that God has put you in, into engaging this work more fully. And we will come back at 5 till the hour and just share some final wrap up and prayer. and then Tammy will be on for the after talk that we've been doing for the extra 30 minutes. So Jason, thank you for putting us into our breakout rooms. Hi friends, welcome back. I know the breakout room I was engaged with had fascinating discussion. I would imagine that you all could say the same. What are some themes that bubbled up for you, or additional questions for Amy and Gio while we still have them with us? Feel free to unmute and jump in. John, you're muted, friend.
Yeah. Well, more of the same. The challenge of addressing real rural concerns and grievances, but at the same time speaking the truth to people, and the fact that people often vote against their own interests for the sake of political ideologies.
There were two things that came out in the group I was in. One is that there seems to be a trend towards what has been a Lutheran advocacy program becoming interfaith. That's true in Seattle, and I've discovered it's true elsewhere. The other thing is, it seems the church is in a position to play a role of bringing people together in a safer situation than most situations, and allowing people not to argue, but to share with each other why they believe what they believe about this issue or that, so that people at least understand each other better.
Excellent. That theme of civil discourse. You know, Nicholas has a great question. Where do we start? How do we prioritize? Amy, what encouragement do you have?
We did touch on this in my small group, and people said, you know, Giovanna's, you know, start where your passion is. I think is one good place. For an individual, sometimes that's harder in a group. Often when I talk to congregations who want to get involved and don't know how to start, you start with a ministry that you already have. Where are you already serving in your community? And go learn about why that service is needed. What are the deeper reasons? And what are the public policy decisions and options that might be on the table, or that you need to create, and begin to have those conversations. Go do interviews in your community. Talk to your local school principal. What are families struggling with? Talk to a judge. What are you seeing in your court? Talk to someone in law enforcement. You know, hospitals. You know, I mean, just think of your community institutions and who can also help you learn. I served a congregation once where we actually did a series like that, and out of it came all sorts of wonderful, concrete ways that service was needed in our community. Not always advocacy, you know, but advocacy, you know, in order to speak, the other place that we start, it's not just on the issue, but it's our willingness and ability to talk about it. And so I think, again, those practicing conversations, the group, the Boston Public Conversations Project, I think that's what they're called. They have this really neat exercise called the Ladder of Assumptions, where, say you're going to talk about an issue where people have kind of entrenched ideas, but you do an exercise where you walk about, well, where did that idea, where did your idea that people who are homeless, you know, are lazy, or they deserve it, or they brought it on themselves, or must have done something. You walk back through your assumptions, and when it's done honestly and well, it reveals points of commonality and what you've learned from your family of origin or the community you grew up in, and how those ideas may have taken hold. You know, so there's some different processes like that to uncover and kind of strip away and bring us maybe to some points of commonality too.
Thank you for that encouragement, Amy. And again, thank you to you and Giovanna for being with us, sharing your wisdom, for the obvious heart with which you engage your work. It literally brings tears to my eyes. And, you know, the ELCA, I think, is quite well known for responding to crisis. one of our growing edges has continued to be recognizing why these crises exist. If it's not a natural disaster, there's some system in place that's allowing these things to happen. And so what can we do to positively affect that, right? And engage in all of these things.
I'll just add our last advocacy convening, which brings bishops and people with lived experience to DC. It was on natural disasters as caused by climate change. So looking at migration, looking at housing, looking at care for creation, everything that was leading to intensified natural disasters that we could actually do something about. So,
right, yeah. Yeah, I blanked out on the fact that, yes, we do contribute every day. The fact that we've hardly had any snow here in Wisconsin is part of our climate change. So friends, thank you again for this time. I believe Tammy will be staying on and helping us have continued conversation. Those of you that have the capacity in your schedule to stay on and continue unpacking this important stuff, we welcome that and invite you. God bless each of you. Thank you for your good work in the kingdom. Thank you for the work of building the beloved community. Each of these things that we're talking about relates directly to that, to God's invitation for us to engage the gifts that God has given us to bring justice, healing, and love to the world. Thank you again, Amy, Giovanna, for your time. Thanks to each of you. I wish I could have been in every breakout room. I always wish that every time. We will see you next week. And I know we all will be in prayer for the inauguration and safety for everyone. Thanks, friends. God bless you.